and Maya lost it at my baby shower. Then she kidnapped my newborn in the middle of the night. Hello, read it. I'm Daniel, and I was 27 when I learned that family was not always a place of warmth and belonging. Love could mend wounds, soften sharp words, and forge unbreakable bonds, but it could not fix what did not wish to be fixed. It could not erase resentment buried too deep, nor could it silence a voice determined to be heard above all others. That realization came slowly, creeping up on me in small moments, intense smiles and disapproving glances in the space between words unspoken and those spoken too harshly. But the day of my baby shower is when it became undeniable. I had always been the type of person to seek harmony, raised by two parents who loved me unconditionally, who encouraged independence and choice. I had never learned to expect anything less. There was no hierarchy in my family, no unspoken rules about who held power. Decisions were made with discussion, respect was given freely, and love was never transactional. My mother had always told me that when I grew up, my life would be mine to shape, that I could make my own choices, build my own family, and expect love to be the thread that held everything together. That belief had carried me through life, had led me to love without fear when I met my husband, had made me believe that our future would be built on mutual respect and partnership. But what I had not understood then, what I had been slow to accept, was that love alone was not always enough. His mother had never approved of me, though in the early days she had hidden it well. She had welcomed me with polite smiles and carefully measured words, had played the role of the doting mother-in-law, just enough to maintain appearances. But the crack had been there, small but present. The way she corrected my choices as though I were a child. The way her approval was always just out of reach, as if I needed to prove myself, as if my place in her son's life was something to be earned rather than freely given. And then, when I became pregnant, those cracks widened into something deeper, something unspoken yet ever-present. It should have been a moment of joy, a celebration of life and new beginnings. But to her it was something else, a shift in power, a reminder that I was the mother now, that I was the one carrying the next generation. And that, in her eyes, was an offense. I saw it in the way she scrutinized every decision I made, from the food I ate to the clothes I wore. The way she inserted herself into conversations about the baby, as though she had more right to dictate its future than I did. And most of all, I saw it in the battle over the name. From the moment I had discovered I was pregnant, I had known what I wanted to name my child. It was a name that carried history, that had meaning beyond just letters and sounds. A name that connected me to my own family, to my past. But she had dismissed it the moment she heard it, as though my choice was irrelevant. She had her own name picked out, one steeped in her family's traditions, one she had already decided was the only acceptable option. At first, I had tried to be diplomatic. I had listened, I had smiled, I had said we would consider it. But the more I tried to keep the peace, the more she pushed. Until one day, she simply stated it as fact, that my child would bear the name she had chosen, that there was no other option. I had realized then that there would be no compromise, that to her, this was not a suggestion, it was a declaration, and that if I did not comply, I was not simply disagreeing. I was defying her. The baby shower had been meant as a celebration, a day of joy, of laughter, of shared excitement for the life growing inside me. My friends had helped plan it, choosing decorations in soft pastels, setting up a table filled with sweet treats and tiny gifts wrapped in ribbons. It was a picture-perfect moment, a gathering of loved ones. But even before she arrived, there had been a heaviness in the air, a tension I could not ignore. My mother had sensed it too, her eyes lingering on me as though she was waiting for something to happen. And then she arrived, late of course, sweeping into the room with an air of expectation, as though the event had been held in her honor rather than mine. She barely acknowledged me, her eyes sweeping over the decorations with an expression I knew too well. Disapproval, not outright, not enough to cause a scene yet, but it was there, in the way she looked at the cake, the gifts, the guests. A silent judgment. And then the small comments began. The cake was too modern. The decorations were unnecessary. The gifts were impractical. Everything in her eyes was wrong. And then came a moment I had dreaded. The name. She brought it up casually at first, slipping it into conversation as though it were already decided. But when I politely corrected her, when I reminded her that my husband and I had already chosen a name, the temperature in the room shifted. A silence fell, thick and uncomfortable. Her smile did not fade, but there was something cold in her eyes. A warning. And then the storm broke. She did not shout at first. She raised her voice just enough to demand attention, just enough to let her anger spill into the room like an unwelcome guest. I was ungrateful, she said. Selfish. I did not respect tradition. I was disrespecting their family. And then, as if the dam had finally burst, the words came tumbling out. I was not good enough. I had stolen her son. I was unworthy. The baby, my baby, was hers before it was mine, and I had no right to make these decisions. The room fell into stunned silence. A moment stretched unbearably long. My heart pounded against my ribs, my hands gripping my stomach as if to shield the life growing inside me from her rage. And then, as if summoned by the sheer force of chaos, there was a knock at the door. Firm, authoritative, the kind of knock that demanded to be answered. I did not know then that everything was about to change, that this moment was not the peak of her fury, but merely the beginning of something far worse. I only knew that, standing there in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a joyful day, with the sound of heavy footsteps approaching, nothing would ever be the same again. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate, a sound that cut through the suffocating silence left in the wake of my mother-in-law's outburst. I stood frozen in place, my hands resting protectively over my stomach, my breath caught somewhere between anticipation and dread. The tension in the room was thick, hanging over us like a storm cloud ready to break. No one moved. No one spoke. Another knock, this time firmer. My mother-in-law's gaze flickered toward the door, her expression shifting just slightly. It was a momentary hesitation, a flicker of something like uncertainty flashing in her eyes before she masked it with the same cool control she always carried. Someone finally moved. My mother, standing closer to the entrance, stepped forward with a deep breath. Her eyes met mine for the briefest moment before she turned the handle and pulled the door open. The weight of the moment crashed into me when I saw the officer standing on the threshold. His uniform was crisp, his presence authoritative, a stark contrast to the pastel balloons and delicate baby shower decorations that filled the space. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but there was nothing funny about what was happening. His gaze swept over the room, quickly assessing the situation before settling on the one person who had caused all of this. My mother-in-law. Her reaction was immediate. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin just slightly, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the same look she had given me 100 times before, calculated, unreadable, prepared for whatever she thought was coming. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice smooth and controlled. This is a family gathering. My son and his wife are expecting their first child. Surely there's no reason for the police to be here. But the officer was not swayed. His expression remained neutral, his gaze unwavering. He turned to look at me instead. We received a call about a disturbance, he said, his voice level. A report of an altercation and threats being made. A disturbance. Threats. The words landed heavily in the room, making my pulse spike. I had not called them. I had been too stunned, too consumed with trying to keep control over a moment that had already spiraled beyond my grasp. But someone had. My eyes scanned the faces of the people around me, searching for the answer. And then I saw her, my mother. She met my gaze with a steady look, a quiet sort of determination in her eyes. Understanding hit me like a wave. She had done it, not out of spite, not out of a need for revenge, but because she had seen what I had refused to acknowledge for far too long. She had seen the manipulation, the control, the unrelenting need my mother-in-law had to make me feel small. She had seen the way I had been breaking under the weight of it, and she had understood something I had not yet been ready to admit. This would never stop. Not unless someone made it stop. The officer shifted his attention back to my mother-in-law. Ma'am, I'd like to ask you a few questions outside. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced once again with that practiced smile. She let out a light, almost dismissive laugh. "Oh, this is so unnecessary," she said, waving a hand as if she could simply brush it all away. "I think my daughter-in-law is just emotional. You know how pregnancy is. It can make women a bit sensitive." A calculated move, a subtle, underhanded way of painting me as irrational, as incapable of handling my emotions. The officer did not react. "Ma'am, please step outside." She bristled then, her composure slipping just slightly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm the grandmother of this baby. I have every right to be here. I have every right to be involved in their decisions." The air in the room shifted. A new, underlying tension laced through it, one that made my stomach tighten. And then my mother stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "Enough," she said, looking directly at my mother-in-law. "You've done enough." For the first time, my mother-in-law faltered, but only for a second. Then she did something none of us expected. She lunged. It happened in a blur, so fast that my body didn't have time to react. One moment, she was standing there, rigid and furious, and the next, she was reaching for me, hands outstretched, fingers grasping, eyes wild. I stumbled back, my breath catching, my arms instinctively wrapping around my stomach to protect the life inside me. She never made it to me. The officer reacted instantly, stepping between us, grabbing her wrist in a firm, unrelenting grip. She fought it, twisting, struggling, her voice rising in a shriek of anger. "No, you don't understand. She's trying to take my grandchild away from me." Her words hit like a slap, but there was no time to process them. The officer tightened his hold, his voice low and authoritative as he issued a command. She didn't listen. She thrashed, tried to yank herself free, but within seconds, another officer entered the room. Before she could fully process what was happening, her hands were behind her back. The click of the cuffs was deafening. A stunned silence followed, a moment where no one seemed to know what to do, what to say. And then, just like that, she was being led out the door, her voice trailing behind her, furious, desperate, filled with venom. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." The door shut behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, unmoving, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my hands still pressed over my stomach. I should have felt relief. I should have felt safe. But all I felt was the lingering weight of her words. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence after her arrest was unbearable. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the room, pressing against my chest like an unseen force. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the door where my mother-in-law had been dragged away. No one knew what to say, how to react, as if speaking would make the events of the afternoon even more real. The baby shower had turned into something unrecognizable, the warmth and joy replaced with an unshakable chill. My mother reached for my hand, her grip steady and reassuring, but I barely felt it. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each thought crashing into the next without direction. The lingering echo of my mother-in-law's voice rang in my ears, her final words carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. This wasn't over. I didn't know what she meant, what she planned, but deep down, I knew she wasn't finished. The guests began to leave one by one, offering hesitant smiles and half-hearted reassurances. Their words barely registered. I stood there in the aftermath, surrounded by torn ribbons and overturned plates, the remnants of a celebration that had been ruined before it could truly begin. The weight of exhaustion settled over me, the reality of everything finally crashing down. My body ached, my stomach felt tight, the stress of the day wrapping itself around me like an inescapable fog. I wanted to believe that her absence meant peace, that I could finally breathe, but something in my gut told me otherwise. The drive home was eerily quiet, my husband's hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. He hadn't said much after everything had unfolded, his expression unreadable, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a different kind than what I had grown used to. This wasn't the quiet of someone avoiding conflict. This was something deeper, something unresolved. The moment we stepped inside, I felt the weight of the day press against my shoulders. The nursery door was open, the unfinished crib in the corner a stark reminder of what today was supposed to have been. This was supposed to be about preparing for new life, not battling against the past. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, twisted in anger, her hands reaching toward me. My mind replayed the scene over and over, dissecting every second, every movement, every word. Fear settled in my bones, irrational yet impossible to shake. She was gone for now, but she wasn't gone for good. The thought gnawed at the edges of my mind, making rest impossible. Morning came with an uneasy stillness. The house was quiet, but my thoughts were anything but. My phone buzzed with unread messages, a mix of concerned friends and distant relatives who had somehow already heard what had happened. There was no escaping it. The situation had spilled beyond the walls of my home, reaching into the corners of my life where I had least expected it. And then the call came, a restricted number. My heart pounded as I hesitated before answering. The moment I heard the voice on the other end, my stomach twisted into knots. It was her, calm, composed, as if nothing had happened, as if the police hadn't dragged her away in front of an entire room of people. There was no anger, no shouting, only a quiet certainty in her tone that sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't calling to apologize. She wasn't calling to explain. She was calling to make it clear that this wasn't over. She knew things she shouldn't have known. She spoke with a confidence that made my breath hitch, as if she had already planned her next move. There was no desperation, no regret, only the unmistakable certainty of someone who believed they were untouchable. She had spent years carefully weaving her control, pulling strings no one had noticed until they tightened around my throat. This was only a temporary setback for her, nothing more than an inconvenience. And that terrified me more than anything. I hung up, but the feeling didn't leave. Her words stuck to me like a shadow, whispering in the back of my mind. She was waiting, watching, and she had no intention of disappearing quietly. The following days were a blur of unease. The house felt different, like an unwelcome presence had settled in the corners where I couldn't quite see it. Small things began happening. A car parked outside at odd hours, always leaving just before I could get a clear look. A misplaced item in the house that I swore I hadn't touched. An envelope in the mailbox with no return address, containing nothing but a single printed sentence. "You don't get to take him from me." Panic settled in my chest, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just anger. This wasn't just resentment. This was something deeper, something that had been growing for years, festering beneath the surface. She had spent so long believing she was the one in control that my pregnancy had shifted something in her, igniting a possessiveness she couldn't contain. She didn't see me as an individual. She saw me as an obstacle. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was letting fear distort reality. But then, the final proof came. I returned home one afternoon to find the front door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it before leaving, but now, it hung slightly ajar. My pulse pounded as I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat at the sight before me. The nursery had been disturbed. The crib had been moved, the baby clothes scattered, a single rocking chair placed in the center of the room, swaying gently as if someone had just left it. And there, resting on the seat, was a note written in careful, deliberate handwriting. A mother always knows what's best. The air left my lungs in a sharp exhale, my body frozen in place. This wasn't just a warning. This was a promise. She had been here, and she wasn't going to stop. The rocking chair creaked as it swayed, ever so slightly, the motion slow, deliberate, as if someone had just risen from it and left the room moments before I arrived. The note sat in its center, the handwriting precise, careful, as though she had taken her time crafting each letter, ensuring I understood the message. A mother always knows what's best. The words clawed at my mind, sinking deep into my bones. I stood frozen in the nursery doorway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every inch of my body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something other than stand there in suffocating silence. My hands instinctively found my stomach, my body acting on a primal instinct to shield the life growing inside me. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to the window, to the corners where shadows lingered, my pulse a frantic rhythm in my ears. The crib was slightly off-center from where it had been before. The baby clothes I had carefully folded, now carelessly tossed across the dresser. She had been here. The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. My mother-in-law wasn't just watching. She wasn't just calling to remind me of her presence. She had crossed the threshold of my home, had stepped into the most sacred space meant for my child, had left behind evidence of her intrusion with quiet, suffocating intent. I didn't remember dialing my husband's number, didn't register the moment my fingers found the call button, but suddenly the phone was pressed against my ear, my voice barely above a whisper as I spoke. The world around me felt distorted, everything too sharp, too loud, yet somehow distant. He arrived minutes later, breathless, eyes scanning the house like he expected to find her lurking in the shadows. The locks had not been forced. No windows had been broken. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious point of entry. It was as if she had materialized inside, left her mark, and disappeared without a trace. The police arrived shortly after. They swept through the house, checked the locks, took the note into evidence, but there was little they could do. There were no cameras, no proof beyond my word that she had been here. And the most unsettling part was that she had been careful. Too careful. If she had broken in, if there had been damage, if there was any clear indication of crime beyond trespassing, they might have been able to do something. But this was just enough to shake me to my core, but not enough for legal action. My husband's face was pale with frustration as he spoke to the officers, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I barely heard their voices, my focus still locked on the nursery, on the space where she had been, on the knowledge that she had been close. Too close. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching. The house no longer felt safe, the walls no longer a barrier between me and the force that had taken root in my life. I stayed in the living room, staring at the door, expecting at any moment for it to creak open, for her to step inside as if she belonged there. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my skin prickle. Every distant sound outside made my breath hitch. My husband locked every door, double-checked every window, but none of it mattered. The problem wasn't just the house. The problem was her. Morning came, but the exhaustion did not dull the fear. The police could do nothing unless she escalated further. And that was the most terrifying part. She was waiting, letting the paranoia fester, letting the silence stretch just long enough for me to think I was safe before she reminded me that I wasn't. And then she made her next move. The letter arrived 3 days later, neatly folded in an unmarked envelope, slipped beneath the front door. My hands shook as I opened it, my breath catching in my throat as I read the first line. I tried to be kind. The words sat heavy on the page, the ink pressed hard against the paper, as if she had gripped the pen too tightly. I gave you a chance. I gave you the opportunity to do what was right. But you refused. You forced my hand. You left me no choice. A chill ran through me as I read on, each sentence digging deeper into my skin like invisible claws. You're not his family. You were never meant to be his family. You were nothing more than a placeholder, something temporary, something that was never supposed to last. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred. I forced myself to keep reading. You cannot take him from me. You cannot take my grandchild from me. A mother knows what's best. A mother fixes what is broken. A single sentence stood alone at the bottom, separated from the rest. You will understand soon. The paper crumpled in my hands as I exhaled sharply, nausea rising in my throat. This wasn't just a threat. This was a promise. She had moved beyond anger, beyond possessiveness. She had convinced herself that she was the only one who truly mattered, that her will was the only one that should be followed. Panic settled into my bones, slow and suffocating. My husband snatched the letter from me, his hands tightening around the paper as he read, his face twisting into something unreadable. He made calls, spoke to lawyers, demanded action from the police. But the law was slow. The law needed more. The police promised to increase patrols near our house. The lawyer promised to look into restraining orders, legal options. My husband promised we would keep the doors locked, that he wouldn't let her near me, that I was safe. But I knew better. She had already been inside once. She had already found a way past locked doors and bolted windows. She had already left her mark. And the worst part was, I knew she wasn't done. She was planning something, and I had no idea what it was. The air in the house had changed. It no longer felt like a home, but a place of waiting, of tension coiling tighter with each passing hour. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows sent a prickle down my spine. The letter haunted me, its words looping in my mind, sinking into the darkest corners of my thoughts. I tried to shake them, to remind myself that we had taken every precaution, that we were being watched over, that the police were aware. But none of it mattered. She had already proven that walls and locked doors meant nothing to her. My husband barely left my side. He was desperate to fix this, to take control of the situation that was slipping through his fingers. Calls were made to the police, to lawyers, to security companies. Cameras were installed, alarms tested. Every step we took felt like trying to hold back an avalanche with our bare hands. We were reacting, not preventing. She was still ahead of us. Days passed in uneasy silence. No more letters. No more calls. No more intrusions. But the absence of action wasn't reassuring. It was worse. She was waiting, letting us settle just enough before she struck again. The quiet was her weapon now, the uncertainty stretching out like an invisible hand around my throat. And then it happened. It was late, past midnight, when I woke with a start. The house was still, but something was wrong. My breath was shallow, my body frozen in place as I listened. The baby monitor on my nightstand emitted nothing but static. My heart pounded as I reached for it, fingers trembling as I adjusted the volume, expecting to hear the usual hum of the nursery's white noise machine. But there was nothing. No soft rustle of air, no faint background hum, just silence. I turned to my husband, nudging him awake, whispering his name with urgency. His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his features. I pointed to the monitor, the soundless screen glowing eerily in the dark. He sat up immediately, his movements sharp, tense. Neither of us spoke as we threw the blankets aside, moving toward the nursery with quiet, cautious steps. The hallway stretched before us, long and dark, shadows clinging to the corners. The door to the nursery was slightly ajar, not closed the way we had left it. My pulse roared in my ears as I reached for the handle, my fingers cold, my breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. The moment the door swung open, I knew. The crib was empty. The small bundle of blankets lay untouched, undisturbed. But our baby was gone. A soundless scream built in my chest, my body locking in place as my mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. My husband pushed past me, his voice breaking into a panicked, strangled cry as he searched the room. But there was nothing, no sign of struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. She had been here, again, and she had taken him. The next minutes were a blur of chaos. My husband ran to check the locks, to call the police, to search the house. I couldn't move. My body was stuck in the doorway, my mind repeating the same words over and over. She took him. She took him. She took him. The police arrived quickly, their presence flooding the house with flashing lights and urgent voices. Officers moved through every room, checking doors, searching for any sign of how she had entered. But there was nothing. No broken glass, no forced locks, no trace of her at all. And then the security footage. We gathered around the screen as the officers played back the recording from the nursery camera. My stomach twisted, ball rising in my throat as the footage flickered to life. The crib, the room, still and quiet. And then movement. A shadow in the corner. A figure stepping into view. Her. She moved with eerie calm, her expression composed, her hands reaching down with careful, practiced ease. She lifted my baby from the crib as if she had done 100 times before. No ruse, no panique, just certainty. And then she turned toward the camera. She looked directly into it, directly at us, and she smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent ice through my veins. Then, just as smoothly as she had entered, she was gone. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't second-guessed. She had known exactly what she was doing, as if she had planned it for years. The police launched into action, calls made, officers dispatched, vehicles tracking every possible route she could have taken. But she had left no obvious trail. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, slipping through our fingers like smoke. Minutes stretched into hours. The house filled with frantic voices, with officers moving in and out, with my husband pacing in frantic, erratic movements. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't process. And then the call came. A police officer's voice, measured but urgent. They had found her. A motel on the outskirts of town. A place tucked away from main roads, isolated, unnoticed. They moved quickly, surrounding the building, forcing entry before she could disappear again. And there she was sitting on the edge of the motel bed, rocking my baby in her arms, humming a soft, eerie lullaby. She didn't fight. She didn't run. She simply looked up, her face calm, her eyes filled with something unreadable. And then she spoke the words that would haunt me forever. I fixed it. Her voice was serene, as if she truly believed she had done something good. As if this had been her way of righting a wrong that only she could see. The officers took her away, their voices stern but distant, their hands firm as they led her from the room. She didn't resist. She didn't protest. She simply let them take her, her eyes lingering on my baby one last time before she disappeared out the door. We got her back, but something inside me had changed. The fear, the uncertainty, the violation, it would never truly leave. She had shown me what she was capable of, how deep her obsession ran. And even though she was gone now, locked away where she could no longer reach us, I knew the truth. She had never seen me as part of the family, and she never would. I held my baby close that night, rocking him in the same chair where she had left her message weeks before. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt safe. It felt hollow, like something had been taken from me that could never be returned. She was gone, but her shadow would always be there,